In the late 1800s, after experimenting with bacterial cultures in the laboratory setting, French chemist Louis Pasteur reproposed that bacteria and other microorganisms, first discovered in 1676, were the pathogenic cause of disease in humans. Thereafter, he promoted his belief as the germ theory, which became entrenched in the science of bacteriology, launched by Robert Koch's discovery of the anthrax bacterium in 1876. Basic forms of the germ theory were first proposed in the year 1025 and continued with modifications and updates to Pasteur's time. Medicine is still following the germ theory today, despite large volumes of science contradicting it. The germ theory states that diseases are due solely to invasion by specific aggressive microorganisms, a specific germ responsible for each disease, with microorganisms capable of reproduction and transportation outside of the body. With the germ theory of disease came an allowance for no personal responsibility for disease conditions. Disease was no longer under the control of the individual. Instead, the protection of our health fell into the hands of the medical professionals whose various potions and poisons could kill off the offending germ. This gave rise to the highly profitable pharmaceutical industry and disempowered the entire human species. Today, the germ theory of disease has given rise to a fear-driven pandemic with immense negative consequences for the public. The germ theory is nothing but a massive profit driver for the disease industry. With that in mind, we are here to dismantle the germ theory and introduce the terrain model, also called the unity theory of disease. This information has the potential to return health back into the hands of the individual where it belongs. Our hope is to present this information in a way that is friendly to regular people who don't have a degree in science, no interest in getting one, nor any desire to break out a medical dictionary. The good news is that health and disease are far easier to understand than the medical industry lets on, and one doesn't need to know all of the medical and scientific lingo in order to understand and achieve health. Let us begin by first introducing ourselves and providing a little background on how each came to study the terrain model and natural hygiene principles which disprove the belief that germs cause disease. Robert, why don't you begin?
All right. My name is Robert Rust. I'm a mechanical engineer. I've been studying natural hygiene and living it for over 30 years. I got into it because of health reasons, depression, anxiety, poor eyesight, used to wear glasses, and back problems, knee problems, and a whole assortment of other illnesses. And now I'm much better again.
My name is Lauren Whiteman. I've been studying natural hygiene for about 5 years now. For more than a decade, I was suffering with extreme depression, at times suicidal thoughts, IBS, chronic pain, chronic fatigue. I was miserable all the time. I was overweight despite eating what I was told was a healthy diet, a balanced diet. And then after finding natural hygiene, I returned to the natural diet for our species, and one by one, all of my health issues just disappeared. So after, being able, healing myself and being well enough to take care of myself and others, I started to take in and foster senior and hospice dogs. And when we brought these dogs in, with the help of connecting with Nora, we learned how to put the principles of natural hygiene in place for these dogs as well, returning them to their species appropriate diet and healing all of their ailments. We saw terminal cancers disappear. We saw dogs with dementia be returned to normal and reverse the course of the dementia. We've seen dogs with hearing loss return to hearing, blind dogs return their sight, seizures improve, just a whole host of health issues returning, these animals back to health. Nora?
My name is Nora Lenz, and in 1990, I read this book, Toxemia Explained, and it didn't really take root at the time. That took about 10 years. About 10 years later, I started looking into natural hygiene more seriously and meeting people who had studied it extensively and practicing it. in my own lifestyle. And I didn't have any serious diseases to reverse, but I was overweight and I had some nagging health issues that everybody thinks is normal that went away after I started living the lifestyle of natural hygiene. That was 20 years ago. And about 15 years ago, I decided to start teaching people how to feed their dogs according to natural hygiene principles, which just involves a species appropriate diet, and began sharing this information. And now I, I want to share this information with everyone, especially in this current climate. So let's start. Robert is the real expert here on what we're going to be discussing. So the questions will be addressed to Robert by Lauren and myself. We're going to alternate back and forth. So we'll just begin by saying that we have established that the germ theory of disease proposes that microscopic organisms are invading our bodies to wreak havoc within, causing diseases, which then require the application of various poisons to the sick body in order to kill the germ. However, there is an alternative theory that stands in opposition to the germ theory called the terrain theory of disease, which puts forth that it is not the germ that causes the disease. Instead, it's the terrain, the internal conditions of the body, that determine the health of the individual. Those conditions, according to the terrain theory, are completely within the control of the individual. This theory was originally postulated by the brilliant biologist Antoine Bechamp and later shown to be true by natural hygienists. The philosophy of natural hygiene, which places emphasis on a clean inner environment, will be explained later in this video. So I'll start the questions. We'll start by asking about Antoine Bechamp. Robert, can you start by telling us a little bit about Bechamp's discoveries?
Well, Bechamp, he was a biologist from the last half of the 1800s. He explored, like so many others were at the time, how life was generated, whether it spontaneously created waste products or breakdown products, or whether that was by microorganisms. Anyways, what he did, he discovered the Microzyma, which is what he called it, a tiny particle, molecular in nature, that could reproduce and maintain itself, and which was found in all living things, and without it, there was no life. So that was his basic discovery, the Microzyma.
What did Bechamp reveal that the Microzyma or Microzyma could do, and how does the Microzyma relate to biological life?
Well, as I said, the Microzyma is a small particle, molecular nature, that could synthesize itself into bacteria, molds, fungi, and yeasts, and which was, of course, when evolved a organism like a body, a animal, or a plant, and so forth.
So that's a basic unit of life. The Microzyma is the basic unit of life.
Yeah, it's the basic unit of life, and the study of biology in the 1900s reveals what that structure is. It's DNA, the DNA particle.
It is DNA. The Microzyma is DNA. Yeah. Okay.
Modern biology has revealed that DNA is a molecule that can replicate itself, split in half, and maintain itself forever. And this is exactly what Bechamp was describing of the particle Microzyma. The DNA is basically an enzyme that can reproduce itself. Enzymes are chemicals that can break down other chemicals or cause their breakdown without being changed themselves. And DNA is a specialized one which can also use those breakdown products to maintain and create an environment for itself and reproduce itself.
And did Bechamp prove his discoveries? And if he did, how?
Yes, Bechamp, he proved them. He cross-referenced all sorts of experiments that he did to establish proof. So he scientifically proved it, meaning there's no possibility for any other conclusion.
I noticed that you have a book about Bechamp in the back there. Is it about him or by him? The
Yeah,
blood in the third, it's by him?
Yeah, this is written by him. He's French, so it's been translated to English. The Blood and the Third Element.
Okay, and that's a book that explains his discoveries and how he proved them?
Yes, it paraphrases his career's work and describes a whole lot of the experiments and processes that he went through to prove that the Microzyma was life and how it worked. It's a very detailed book and requires studying to understand, and no one does that much because the book is basically suppressed, kept out of our mainstream school systems.
But it is still available, right?
Very available,
okay.
plus other books that he wrote that expand upon the Microzyma even more. Although most aren't translated yet.
Right, right.
So, Robert, so how is bacteria created inside the body?
Well, bacteria, as Bechamp pointed out, is created in the body by DNA itself, by the microzyma or microzyma. And when supportive conditions come about, it automatically reacts with the chemicals or nutrients or substances in its environment and breaks them down to create more of itself, and then eventually synthesize those elements, those byproducts of the reactions into a house for itself, skin around it, and then other substances within that skin to create a simple cell, like a bacterial cell or a fungus. And through evolution, great periods of time, it will evolve into a cell, an animal cell or a plant cell, and then into multiple celled structures like organs, and then eventually into a body, an animal body or a plant body.
Okay. And can you explain to us what pleomorphism is?
Well, pleomorphism is the change from one bacterial form or microorganism form to another. So you can have one bacteria becoming another. And what's happening is the microzyma is just changing itself, its structure, according to the environment that is around it, which is the chemical environment. And it cannot help doing this. The microzyma or DNA is merely maintaining itself, establishing how it can live in that new environment so that it can continue existing.
So basically, if I'm understanding you correctly, we can have one type of bacteria when the terrain changes because of our diet, the internal environment within the body, that bacteria can change form. So it's not that we have all of these different bacterias and they're invading our body. It's that as the terrain changes, one bacteria changes form in order to survive, essentially. Is that correct?
Yes, it's really correct. It's really the DNA molecule, the microzyma, that is changing its form in order to exist, to continue existing as itself. It does this by making more complex versions of itself. We get all sorts of different lengths of DNA molecules within the body. If the environment is homeostatic, it remains balanced. If a person's eating correctly or following correct health habits that allow that, then the DNA will not produce bacteria, it'll just produce cells and continue running its life. When the environment within the body, the chemical environment, becomes a little too acidic, say from over buildup of waste from overworking the body, that higher acidity causes the DNA to start breaking its cellular structure down and resynthesize that into bacterial form or fungal form or yeast. These are very simple organisms the DNA readily transforms itself into that structure. When the environment has been returned to normal, the DNA will only allow regular cells to be produced. The bacterial cells that would produce under abnormal environments are very particular to the chemical constitution of that environment. So it changes, and then it'll change from one form of bacteria to another, or one mold to another.
Okay. So what runs and controls the body? Does the body control the bacterial populations, or are bacteria independent entities running amok in the body like the germ theory presents?
Bechamp, he pointed out, he scientifically proved that this Microzyma totally runs the show. It creates all life forms, such as the bacteria and viruses, bacteria and molds and so forth, and bodies themselves. So it's running the show. It provides the coding, that's the DNA coding that controls all chemistry in the body. And it will produce bacterial populations according to the chemical environment, how it's been changed. It'll produce bacteria within the body or without the body. The DNA exists everywhere from decomposed bodies prior, like once existed but now have died and then have decomposed. It's floating around in the air and the rock and everywhere, and it will, when it gets the right conditions, warmth, water, food supply, it'll turn itself into bacteria, whether that's outside the body or inside the body.
Okay, so basically the DNA, the Microzyma, is what's running the show and
Yes.
controlling all functions, both creating the bacteria and creating our healthy cells.
Exactly.
Okay. Nora, would you like to maybe move us into Pasteur and some of his claims?
Robert, can you tell us a little bit about what Pasteur's beliefs were regarding germs?
Well, Pasteur, he believed that microorganisms in the air were responsible for creating disease within humans and other creatures. He felt they invaded them through whatever means to force the body to behave improperly. He never showed how this invasion occurred. Pasteur never created any thorough experiments to show that. He basically just cherry-picked various experiments, and ignored those experiments that denied his claims.
Why was this belief promoted and Bechamp's work suppressed, and why does this continue today?
Well, this belief allowed Bechamp and his industrial family, you could say.
You mean Pasteur?
Pasteur, right. Yeah, Pasteur promoted the belief because it allowed him and his pharmaceutical industry to create drugs to combat the supposed virus or bacteria that was invading the body, to kill it and attempt to create profit for themselves, for the industry, for him. This has continued today as modern medicine, the industry of modern medicine and pharmaceuticals, as well as modern biology, which merely tries to find different ways to poison microorganisms and other structures like that.
Pasteur had many beliefs. One of them was that there is good bacteria and bad bacteria in the body. Is there really good bacteria and bad bacteria? I think we've already established that's not the case.
Yeah.
Because it's really about a clean or dirty internal environment.
That's right. There's no such thing as good or bad bacteria. There's just bacteria. These are DNA that synthesize themselves into bacteria according to the altered or environment that they find themselves in, whether it's in the body or outside. We could call a normal environment within the body created by normal living habits followed by a person good or clean. And when that gets altered because it becomes too acidic, say from a person working too much, creating too much metabolic waste debris inside themselves.
Or eating too much.
Yeah, exactly. Eating too much, which is metabolic.
Eating the wrong foods.
Right. Not forces the body to work too much and creates a lot of waste. And that creates a so-called dirty or a soiled internal environment. And that leads the DNA to start breaking itself down from the cellular form into a bacterial form.
We've heard a lot lately about Koch's postulates of causation, and why are they important to determining causation? To me, it's just common sense, it's just logic. But why don't you explain Koch's postulates?
Well, Koch's postulates were brought about to give those that were researching into bacterial cause of disease a means by which to test whether their idea was false or not. It's a set of postulates that are limited in that one has to be able to follow those postulates to show whether their ideas are true or not. I could go over the 4 postulates if you'd like.
Yeah, why don't you?
A set of 4 rules or 4 needs to be met. Number 1, the microorganism that supposedly causes disease must be found in abundance in all sick individuals and never in healthy individuals. That's number 1. Number 2, it must be isolated from the individual and then grown in pure culture. In pure meaning you're getting just that bacteria. And then 3, it must be taken, isolated from re-inoculated or re-injected into a healthy individual and cause the very same symptoms or disease as the original disease. And then 4th, that microorganism within the sickened individual must be isolated and shown to be exactly the same as the very original one that caused the disease. Those are the 4 postulates.
Okay. And apparently they were originally accepted and then modified. I've been surprised myself in my research to see that they're still referred to in modern medicine, even though they're completely ignored in practice. Can you account for that? Can you explain that?
Well, they're a good method to determine truth. Medicine ignores them because it's found that it can't abide by them. For example, in the first postulate, where 1 microorganism is supposed to be found in abundance in 1 sick individual but not unhealthy, they found bacteria that is supposedly causing diseases. They found those bacteria in healthy individuals, and the healthy individual wasn't sick. But then they also found sick people that they could not find the bacteria that supposedly caused that disease in them.
Right.
And so they just avoid that and make excuses and change the wording slightly a bit of those postulates. They don't hold themselves accountable to a proving system in medicine or modern biology. They neglect to do that because they can't.
Okay. And the postulates in their original form were a proving system. And there's actually a very prestigious institution in Europe named after Robert Koch. And I'm just wondering how that disconnect can be reconciled. If medicine still talks about Robert Koch and his postulates, how can they avoid the pure logic that they reveal and the lack of medicine's ability to prove what they're claiming?
Well, it gives them a somewhat scientific look. The reality is because they're not following the original postulates to the letter and making excuses instead, they revealed and exposed themselves as a non-scientific organization. They follow theory or ideas or speculation, hypotheses, instead of proving systems. They're basically making stories. This is modern medicine. This is modern biology. And we have institutions based on that. And this is the Koch Institute now. Another example of where they would run into problems with the postulates is in that in the second one, where they're required to isolate the microorganism from a sick individual and then grow it in pure culture, they found that they can't always do that. So in other words, they make a claim that some microorganism is causing a disease, but they can't isolate it. So they don't even know if it really does. They don't have a way to establish that because they can't isolate it. So they have to go to other means and other stories to support their original idea, basic story making. Then they will make up excuses and say, well, the bacteria will only cause a disease in the person if the person is susceptible to the bacteria. And that's a cop-out. Mm-hmm. If something is a cause of something, it will cause it every time. Right. And if it doesn't, it is not the cause, it won't. And so when they find that there's a bacteria there that didn't cause anything, or if it did, they just say, oh, it's susceptible. But an astute person will realize then it's what is susceptible. The susceptibility is where the cause is. That's where one has to look for the cause. What's making a person susceptible? And then we're right back to terrain, the soil that the bacteria is in. That is what has supported the growth of the bacteria or not.
Right. Okay. On the topic of susceptibility, we hear a lot about antibodies, and it seems like in some diseases, the presence of antibodies means that you have the disease. In other diseases, it means you're proof against the disease. And I'm just wondering if antibodies really exist, what they are, and if their existence has even been proven.
Well, antibodies definitely exist. They're a protein molecule. Proteins are acids, and generally they're enzymes. They are involved in the breakdown of other materials. The DNA of the body, being an enzyme that can reproduce itself, creates many other enzymes that it uses then to control the chemical environment around it, to digest it and create more of itself. Now, an antibody is just one more protein created by DNA to control its metabolic environment. And the antibody is a chemical that attaches to waste products to mark them for decomposition by other chemicals, other enzymes that DNA has produced in the body, whether it's within a cell or outside. So these are just little markers, little protein markers that attach themselves, react with a waste particle to mark it for destruction by another enzyme. It's like, say, one human being holding a second human being still so that a third human being can pummel it to death. All right?
That's an antibody. That's the antibody is part of the body's defensive system.
Yeah, it's part of the body's cleansing system. The body has means by which to get rid of the metabolic waste that it creates in this metabolism. That's called our lymph system. So it's a cleanup system. It recycles much of the waste, but some of it's not usable and gets rid of that. And antibodies are involved in that process. And much of the lymph system is called a defensive system, but it's actually just a cleanup system. We do have defensive abilities, such as our ability to grow calluses to protect our internal skin from too much wear and so forth.
And antibodies, just one more question about antibodies. They can give no reasonable indication that disease is either happening or not happening in the body. Is that not right?
No, it doesn't quite work like that. The antibodies are part of the waste removal system. But if there are more waste being created, the body will create more antibodies, more of these proteins to mark the garbage so it can be eliminated from the body or recycled. Now,
so
when
a sicker person with the more polluted terrain will produce more antibodies.
exactly, the more deteriorated or acidic their fluids are, the more antibodies are created because more cells are breaking down because they can't live in that acidic environment.
So Robert, what do antibiotics do, and can they ever be helpful?
Well, antibiotics were invented by the pharmaceutical industry to destroy bacteria. What antibiotics do, they're a chemical that reacts with the skin of a bacteria, breaking it down and thereby destroying the bacteria's ability to live. The bacteria, of course, is made by DNA, and so it's preventing the DNA from being able to live as in that form, bacterial. This was the solution by Pasteur and his associates in the pharmaceutical industry to prevent disease, conquer disease in the human or other organism by using these drugs, these poisons. They're life poisons. They're called antibiotics, anti meaning opposite, and biotic meaning life. So they're anti-life structures, which is exactly what they do. They prevent DNA, life itself, from operating properly and normally and healthfully.
Okay, thank you. So one question we get often is if the body is using bacteria to recycle waste and clean itself out, do all humans make the same exact bacteria? And can one human's bacteria be given to another human and then have that bacteria start the process of detoxing the body, cleaning the body? So in other words, if I sneezed out some of my bacteria, put it into your body, could that bacteria start to clean up the dead cells, break down waste, trigger a cold or flu detox event in your body?
No, that's an impossibility. Bechamp proved that. The DNA or Microzyma within each person's body is particular to that body. It's a certain DNA structure, and it exists like that because that's all that can be done to create that body. That DNA or Microzyma has to be of that form to be able to work as that body. Other DNA can only work in other bodies of what it can produce, such as a bacterial DNA. It can only produce that bacteria. And that's it.
Okay, thank you.
And it will do so according to the environment. So no bacteria can invade another person to do something in there because that is not appropriate for that body. And the body itself, through using with its DNA within it, that DNA will create bacteria within that body according to that internal environment. That body, the DNA in it, doesn't need bacteria from the outside to come in to produce bacteria. The DNA will produce its own bacteria or mold or yeast or whatever.
Okay, so our DNA, the Microzyma, is creating our bacteria. It's unique to us.
Exactly.
So in the same vein, a lot of people are promoting the idea that we can eat rotten foods like sauerkraut or yogurts, or even in extreme cases, people are promoting the idea of eating rotten meats in order to get good bacteria from these rotting foods to repopulate our own gut bacteria. Is that possible? Can we eat rotten food and put good bacteria from the rotten cabbage or whatever food into our digestive tract and create a clean terrain, better bacteria?
No, that won't happen. The human being has a certain diet that it needs to eat, which is normal to it, which the human has evolved to. And when it does that, then correct environment is created within the stomach and internal organs, and then the body remains in a healthy state. One cannot artificially try to create that environment. It's much too complex. But one can't do that by eating false foods, such as fermented foods that might have various bacteria or rotted meats or whatever. those will go, and if a person does eat those will go into the gut and they create a certain chemical environment, and the body will react to that. It'll try to digest it, but there'll be excess waste produced and the body react to that in symptomatic fashion because it's an abnormal chemistry for the body. You must remember that the cavity of the stomach and the intestines, the mouth, the throat, and so forth, they're actually outside of the body. Inside the body means within the fluids, within the blood, within the lymph, within the cells themselves, within that structure. That's internal. Anything outside of the cell or outside the bloodstream or outside the lymph system, that's outside of the body. So when we eat, what we're really doing is putting some food into a cavity, and our body's injecting enzymes, acids, and other material in it to break it down in a manner that the body then can use the broken down products to run itself and recreate itself.
Okay, thank you. So getting into a little bit of the ideas surrounding germs creating disease, are there alternative explanations to, for example, several members of a household getting sick at the same time? Often the germ theory is promoted through this, the child gets sick, comes home, mom and dad get sick as well. And then the claim is that a germ has floated through the household and created these detox events in all of the household members. Is there an alternate explanation for why these people are getting sick at the same time or around the same time?
Yes, there's an alternative explanation for that. And it is that these people are following similar habits. Similar habits lead to similar effects, similar results. So if, for example, if a person drinks alcohol, that person can be expected to get drunk just like everybody else will, because they all have the same biological constitution. And so it is that when you have members in a household eating similar food, breathing similar air, doing similar activities, their body will get overwhelmed by their false habits and they'll react in similar ways, not always exact ways, but different degrees of those ways. And by that, they may falsely conclude that they all got sick at the same time from an invading microorganism. That's easy to do. It's a specious idea, but it's false.
Okay, and why do chickenpox parties appear to work? So, or people send their kids to somebody's house who supposedly has the chickenpox, and then a week or 10 days later or something, the child also gets the chickenpox. Why do we see this happening, or do we see this happening?
Well, we see people or children going to a party and participating in the same decadent habits, such as eating cake and junk food and pop and so forth, getting very excited, which is very difficult for their bodies, all of their bodies to process, to metabolize. And so they're overwhelming their bodies, creating a lot of acidic waste within their blood and lymph and cells, which causes them all to act symptomatically. Their cells then act oddly because they can't process the chemicals to create energy and movement and so on and so forth. And so they all exhibit these symptoms and they're claimed to have caught it from each other, but really what they did is just follow the same poor lifestyle habits.
Right, so it's the pizza and the cupcakes and the candy that's really creating these overwhelming issues on the body. And this is also why we see colds and flus pop up around Halloween, Thanksgiving, Christmas, Valentine's Day, Easter, where everybody is overindulging, overeating, and generally eating things that are even worse than their standard diet in quantities greater than their standard diet, thereby triggering essentially the release valve for overload, and then the body has to trigger a clean out. Correct?
Right. Yeah, correct. It's like they've pushed themselves all into a marathon, exhausting their body, and then their body increases in its waste levels because it's tired, can't get all rid of the waste, and then they experience the feelings and effects that come from that overly acidic, waste-filled body.
Great, thank you. So Well, we know that chickenpox is not exclusively a childhood disease. Adults do get it, and it's also not exclusively a one-time event. Adults sometimes get it as for a second time in their life. But why is it generally that children tend to get far more of these skin eruption diseases like the measles and chickenpox and scarlet fever and foot and mouth disease and all of these other skin detox symptoms? And we see that lessening as we move into adulthood.
Well, as a human grows, its internal chemistry slightly changes. When we're young, we produce certain hormones to allow our body to continue growing, to expand, larger organs, increased abilities. And as we mature into adults, we lose those hormones, those production abilities, and that changes our chemistry, and that means our body will behave differently under these similar conditions. So when we're young, we can overpollute ourselves by overworking our metabolism, by eating false foods and picking out on them and so forth. And due to the hormone nature in the body will react. A child has much more vital organs. They're just having been formed and we're still growing, so they have a lot of power to themselves. They're more vital, and the skin being a cleansing organ will then pass out waste in an attempt to clean the body out and maintain a proper internal environment. Now, when we're older, our skin has deteriorated. So we see all these spots and wrinkly skin, which is hard skin. It's showing that their cells have died and have been replaced by scar tissue. And so the skin loses its ability to be the powerful cleansing organ that it once was. And so the body goes to other avenues, uses the kidneys or the liver more, or stores it as waste in so-called tumors to overcome the pollution in the body. And so we see new symptoms come, or different symptoms generally in adults than we do in kids when they're first polluted. So we don't get those contagious diseases in adults as much as we see in children.
Okay, so basically, as we age, our body becomes more and more polluted. Our energy becomes less over the years, and so we're not able to create these higher energy detoxification cleaning symptoms. We start moving into like lower energy constructive symptoms.
Yeah, we degenerate more. We're not able to get those chemicals out. Those have broken down our body and reduced its ability to react to the waste. So the older a person gets, the less able they are to go into these symptomatic crises, you could call them, to eliminate waste. Ultimately, when a person's near death, they have no ability to cleanse themselves, and they won't have any symptoms. They're just going to die. They have no vitality to remain as a whole body anymore. Whereas when you're a child, you have maximal vitality, ability to maintain the body as a body and keep itself clean.
Okay. And if I could just for a second just expand on that a little bit. So generally we see this where children have the vitality, but what about in the cases of children being born with cancer and tumors? Is this a reflection of the lack of vitality from the parents and over toxicity being passed down into the child? What accounts for this, where some children are able to detox and have these skin eruptions to clean the body, and then others are moving so quickly into cancers, tumors, serious diseases?
In the womb, the child is growing, and it's a human there, and it gets exposed to all the toxicity of the parent or the mother who if she has a poor diet, will have in her own body. That creates an environment within the growing child's body that causes the DNA of that child's body to create bacteria, molds, yeast, and fungi as well. So the baby itself is overburdened by waste that's coming from the mother. That's the baby's getting nutrition from the mother, but if that's false nutrition or the mother's fluids are over acidic, then the child's system will be over acidic too and develop these diseases such as cancer and various other ones. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So if you look into modern medicine, their claim is that there are tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of different diseases. Are there really tens of thousands of different diseases? Can you explain the difference between natural hygiene's singular disease concept of toxemia and the medical industry's tens of thousands of different disease labels?
Yeah, well, the term disease just means that in discomfort, not at ease, at dis-ease. And so there's many ways to be at disease. These are all the symptomatic behaviors of the body that result from the body being overly polluted in its own waste product primarily, but it also can be toxified by ingesting poisons, harmful substances. So we have many, many ways that a body can express internal toxicity, and these are called symptoms. A group of symptoms will be classified into a disease by medicine as if these symptoms are attacking the body as a one unit. One can select a whole bunch of different symptoms, this and that and the other, and create all sorts of different names for each collection. But what remains is that they're all caused by the same thing, which is the over toxicity of the internal fluids and cells and the bloodstream of the body. So the disease is really only one disease. It's a abnormally acidic body, expressing that acidity in many ways.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Nora, did you want to move into viruses?
Yeah, we're going to talk about viruses generally now. Robert, what is a virus in reality, and what effect, if any, does it have on the body?
A virus is genetic matter encased usually in the skin. Modern medicine, biology, and pharmaceuticals, they're looking for a bad guy to legitimize their belief that something has attacked the body. A virus is a bit of DNA or RNA, which is genetic matter, and this is what life itself is. Life is DNA, and it makes RNA to create proteins for itself to synthesize itself and reproduce. So in the life of a body, the cells are reproducing themselves, and they have to break themselves down at times because their ability to exist as that form has worn out. And in doing so, the DNA breaks the whole cell down using this enzyme that it's created. And within the debris will be a lot of RNA particles and, of course, the DNA. And that is called the virus by medicine and portrayed as something that has attacked the cell and forced the cell to reproduce all this DNA and RNA, and then the cell is destroyed by that. So it's like medicine is calling a normal part, well, they're calling a normal part of a cell and of the body something evil so they can legitimize their belief that something attacked it to cause it to break down, whereas in reality, that substance was just a normal part of the body that the body was using to, or the DNA was using to run its life normally. Get rid of waste, re-establish a construct or a form for itself that could live within that new environment in the body or whatever.
Okay, so it's just essentially a harmless a particle of cellular debris.
Yeah, it's cellular debris. That's usually what the virus is.
Can you, I'm sorry, since you mentioned RNA and DNA, can you just quickly tell us the difference between RNA and DNA in lay language?
Okay, well, DNA is the molecule of life.
Mm-hmm.
It forms itself into strands, which you call chromosomes. Within that is the coding for all other chemicals produced in the body that then sustain the life of the DNA particle. It's called the DNA particle in each cell. All the extent of that's called the genome. and it's all the DNA that makes that cell run. Now, RNA is a molecule similar to DNA that DNA creates. DNA will take the DNA molecule, which is very long, millions of molecules, will take a section of itself and recreate it, modify it slightly, and that is the RNA molecule. Very, very similar to DNA, but slightly different and more reactive. And so it will then produce proteins, and those proteins, such as enzymes, antibodies, will be used by the DNA to create its cellular structure, to maintain it, and even to reproduce it. Is
Okay.
that clear?
Yes, very. And when lab techs look under a microscope or run their tests to identify a virus, what are they actually looking at?
What they're looking at again is DNA debris. It'll be either DNA molecules or RNA molecules. RNA being very similar to DNA, a little more reactive, the same molecular structure, very similar. That is what they're looking at. The cells, the DNA within the cell produces those, and when the cell dies, it disintegrates itself and releases all its content to the lymph or the fluids that it exists within. And that dying process is falsely represented by medicine as something having attacked that cell and caused it to die, when in reality that process was just the normal metabolic functioning of the cell and of DNA. So they're looking at this DNA matter or RNA matter within the body, and the RNA and DNA matter is automatically and always wrapped in a skin, a fat protein or a sugar protein layer, just as we as the larger body have a skin around us holding our contents all together. Then this is then proposed by medicine when they see this DNA or RNA molecule wrapped in a protein fat skin as this virus, so-called virus that attacked the body. So they've made up a story, a bad guy story, good guy, bad guy. The virus itself, it's spent DNA matter or RNA matter. It's not usable, it needs to be broken down by the rest of the body. And it can no longer function, and so it is dead, you would say. And medicine proposes that this dead substance can take over a living cell, force the living cell to reproduce that dead substance, so that the dead substance can then go on to do the same to other cells. Instead of realizing, no, it's all just the DNA within cells taking care of itself, breaking cells down when they're no longer, the chemistry of them will no longer support their function.
We've heard a lot lately about exosomes, and some people are proposing that exosomes are the same thing as viruses. Is that true?
Well, it's true. We have exosomes that are a little RNA structure within cells that is used by the cell to metabolize waste, break it down, and remove it from one cell, maybe be processed then in another cell. This exosome, the small structure that contains RNA, and that is being claimed as this COVID virus or as a virus and portrayed as attacking the body, the cell. All right?
Okay. And some people have gone on to claim that exosomes are solvents, that they have lifelike properties, that they communicate with the body. Is that true? Do they have any? Are they solvents? Are they communicators? Do they have any power to act on their own?
They're part of the chemistry of the body. The whole body is made of chemicals. There's one chemical within the body that can maintain and reproduce itself. It's the only chemical that can do that. Bechamp proved that, and that's the Microzyma, the DNA. It can replicate itself. No other molecules can. The DNA produces all sorts of chemistry in the body, and this chemistry, part of which will be the exosomes, are used to help, or used by the DNA to run the body, to run the cell. So there's automatic communication within that. It's an extremely complex, infinitely complex chemical system. So that, in this case, exosome is a particle of structure that's being used to rid the body of waste and break the waste down into possible particles that can be reused by the body. The body is parsimonious. It recycles anything and everything it can. It doesn't want to waste its life and energy.
Right. So it's a helpful, natural, normal part of every living body.
Exactly.
Okay. Can viruses or whatever they are, exosomes or dead particles, exist outside of the so-called host body? And is there any point in sanitizing our hands or surfaces?
Well, viruses, again, are in reality DNA and RNA molecules that are breaking down. And they, of course, that molecule, DNA, RNA, exists everywhere in the air because bodies are decomposing, dying, plants are dying. We're talking about plant animal kingdom and the bacterial kingdom and so forth. They're always breaking down, and their broken down products evaporate or go into the air and circulate, or really go into the rock and all over, anywhere and everywhere, infinitely. And so we have these so-called viruses everywhere. All right, it's dead or non-functioning organic matter, which, when it gets into the correct environment, which can start to synthesize itself into bacteria and more complex forms of DNA embodied life.
Mm-hmm. And so it probably goes without saying that sanitizing hands, washing hands when they're not dirty is pointless, right. Slightly harmful ritual.
Yeah, it's pointless. You don't see wild animals and all other species on the planet, of which there are millions, doing that. They don't have to do that. We're just taught that because it falls out of the germ theory and other beliefs that outside organisms are attacking the human body, and therefore the person has to keep clean of these substances. So they use chemicals and these sanitizers to supposedly kill bacteria so the bacteria doesn't attack the body. That's false. No bacteria can attack the body, never has, never will. The body creates its own bacteria according to its internal environment, whether it's in cavities like the stomach or within the body itself.
Okay, thank you. So, Robert, one of the current narratives driving a lot of fear around the current, pandemic and situation that's going on right now is that the virus itself was created in a lab as a method of bioterrorism. I think we've established well that the virus is not alive, cannot create disease, does not have any functions. It's just cellular debris being recycled by the body and ejected by the body. So is there any legitimate concerns to this idea that is spreading about bioterrorism, about viruses being created in the labs, superbugs being created in the labs and released onto the public?
No, that's impossible to create a virus or a DNA in a lab, or RNA, and try to create a life form out of that. Only nature can do that. That takes billions of years of evolution. We're not able to, as human beings, create life. We can create artificial objects like an engine or something like that, but not life itself. That's just an idea that comes out of the false belief that there's death-seeking organisms out there like bacteria that will want to kill humans. It's biologically impossible.
Okay, thank you.
And so let me just interject. So the concept of bioterrorism would always, if it's employed, would always employ poisons, right? It wouldn't employ biological.
Yeah, every organism creates waste, and those can be concentrated if you have enough of the organism, and that will be a harmful substance for other organisms. For example, certain bacteria create acetic acid, that's vinegar. If you grow tons of the bacteria that produce that, you feed them the right food, they'll produce a lot of vinegar. And then that vinegar, if consumed by a human, will acidify the human completely and kill them. All right. So it's the same thing. Bacteria create various products depending on what type of substance they're eating, and you can get some very toxic substance produced. If you collect that together, you now create a poison that you could use to poison people. The bacteria itself can do nothing to the human or any other organism. It can only grow itself and create waste. So you could take the bacteria as much as you want. You could eat it, you'll digest it, or you could throw it onto another person. It won't do anything because it doesn't have its environment to produce its waste. It's harmless.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Robert. So vaccines are often promoted based on the claim that they have eliminated childhood diseases like measles and polio. Have we really eradicated these diseases, or have we just changed the name, changed the diagnosis of these diseases? And if we have eradicated them to some extent, how did we actually eradicate these diseases?
Yeah, there's many ways that modern medicine uses to pose threats and make them disappear. We're not told about true causes, such as, say, polio. Polio was a collection of symptoms created by poisoning by agricultural chemicals, largely in the 1940s, 1930s, and at other times as well. For example, when they first came out with these fumigants, they would spray them in the streets and kids would run behind them in the clouds of the fumigants. And these fumigants are destructive of the spinal nerve, and polio is a lesion of that, and it causes eventual paralysis and lack of ability to breathe. That polio was reduced or went away when they stopped using those particular type of chemicals, some kind of phosphate, and replaced with DDT and so forth, which produced its own problems. So we just had one poison replaced by another, and then the symptoms of the previous one that were produced in humans went away. Now, they also renamed polio other diseases, such as, I think, Guillain-Barré syndrome and encephalitis and so forth. And this is classic method by modern medicine to make it seem as if one disease disappeared because they may use certain chemicals, but then another one comes up and then you have to use some more poisons to eradicate that one. They do this all the time. Measles would be just a childhood reaction to excess toxicity in the body, which then medicine treats with drugs and creates even worse symptoms. The first symptoms of measles are runny nose, headache, lowered energy, and a cough, which is exactly what a cold is, or a very mild flu. And these are all created by elevated internal waste or toxicity, acidity within the body and the cells of the body via DNA reacting to that, not being able to function properly, and thereby acting abnormally, which we call symptoms.
Okay, so I just want to reiterate that. So the cold, the flu, the measles, the chickenpox, these are all body reactions of our self-cleaning, self-healing body, ejecting the toxic waste that has built up over time. And these are a natural response to abnormal conditions, abnormal internal terrain conditions caused by an abnormal diet, yes, creating a unclean terrain, which then requires the body to clean itself.
Right. The increased acidity and waste production in the body prevents the correct chemistry from happening in the body. For example, when we eat too many foods, we produce too much carbon dioxide in the body from that metabolic breakdown process. Carbon dioxide exists in water as carbonic acid, which is a slight or a weak acid, that increased acidity prevents the body acting normally. It prevents oxygen transfer from red blood cells to all the other cells of the body. And cells need oxygen to run themselves properly. When the oxygen is reduced, they cannot do that. They lower themselves in function. And these are called symptoms. So the lowered energy, that's because the cells aren't able to run their metabolism. They don't have oxygen to do that, not enough. That's called lack of energy, lowered energy, a symptom. Now the heightened acids of the body, say is carbonic acid or improperly broken down proteins, you get amino acids and you get lactic acid and so forth. These irritate cells, and that's experienced as headaches and itchiness and ringing ears and so forth. More symptoms, that's improper behavior of those cells because the chemical environment has been changed to one that's more acidic. And on it goes. You get cells secreting mucus to protect themselves from that heightened acidity that they find in the fluids around them. And that mucus secretion we experience as runny noses and coughing, phlegm, and so forth. So these are the symptoms of a cold, these first acute symptoms that the body has produced and the result as a reaction to this acidity. When we pollute ourselves even further, we get even more symptomatic reaction heightened, and we go from a cold to a flu to, if drugs become involved, even more severe chemical reactions, which you all call symptoms. All right.
Okay. So essentially, the symptoms are the cure for the body to remedy the disease conditions in the body. So the toxic conditions in the body are remedied by the symptoms. The symptoms are the cure.
Yeah, symptoms are they're a demonstration of the toxicity in the body. They're showing that the body is having difficulty cleansing itself, getting rid of waste. As it gets rid of the waste, it lowers the acidity of the body, and then the cells of the body are able to get more oxygen and operate normally. So as that waste level is reduced, the health of the normal operation of the body returns, and we call that health. We call that being at ease. And in that, we don't experience not at ease. We don't experience the dis-ease.
Perfect, thank you. So could you explain a little bit about what caused HIV and AIDS? Because this is, I think, one of those viruses that is deeply feared in the psyche of most people. Obviously, we've established that the virus, the cellular debris, is not causing problems. So what was it that created these symptoms, and why have they not come out with a vaccine like they have done with the measles or other body cleaning events?
HIV, so-called HIV, is similar to polio. It's caused by a poisoning of the body by taking chemicals that the human shouldn't be taking. Polio was mostly caused by agricultural chemicals damaging the nervous system, the spinal cord. HIV is created by taking chemicals, such as recreational drugs or medical drugs in higher quantities. HIV was a collection of symptoms, of poisoning symptoms that were demonstrated by the gay community in large degree in New York, Miami, San Francisco. There were gay bathhouses where a lot of drugs were used in order for those individuals to entertain themselves, have more sex, and so forth. For example, they would use poppers, which are a chemical that causes the anal sphincter to relax, and that would allow for more sex. These individuals were also believing in antibiotics, and so before they would have sex, they would pump themselves full of antibiotics, and antibiotics are anti-life. They damage the chemical systems of the body and cause many symptoms. So these individuals, by taking all their recreational drugs, cocaine and others, plus these antibiotics and these poppers, were devastating their systems, and they began to break down. They were losing weight. They would have all these strange cancers or lesions, and many, many other symptoms. And those symptoms were collectively called HIV, as if it was a new entity that had attacked the body instead of that all these chemicals were damaging the body. Now, medicine is always looking for bad guys to explain these symptoms, these symptom complexes. And so it doesn't look to chemicals that itself is producing to fight disease. It looks to imaginary evil threats from the outside. So in that we got this HIV campaign. Then they invented new drugs to try and kill the so-called virus. HIV, the drugs that were used in HIV came out of the medics or modern biology and medicine's failed attempt to find a way to cure cancer through using vaccines and other chemicals, and it didn't work there. So when these symptoms of AIDS of these gay people came about, they tried to apply it to that because they believed that that was the virus that caused that. So HIV treatment is an extension of cancer treatment, which uses all these toxic chemicals to try and kill cancer cells in the body. And one of the chemicals they came up with was AZT, which is an extremely toxic chemical, which when given to these gay people would kill them within a year or so. And so that the gay community realized that and stopped taking it and started cleaning up their health habits, not using so many drugs and antibiotics, and that resolved that problem to a great extent. Now, HIV, these symptoms are not just caused by drugs that these people were using, but they're caused by any drugs, highly toxic drugs that are put in the body. So we see that transfusion patients develop these symptoms because they're being given factor VIII and a host of other drugs to control their body's reaction to the organ or the blood that was put into them that is not their own blood. The body, the DNA of our body will automatically react against that. So if you suppress that reaction by using drugs, you will allow the body still to use that blood. But in so doing, you poison the body, and many, many other symptoms will occur of that poisoning, and that's then called HIV or AIDS. All right. Malnutrition will lead to AIDS because the body isn't being given the right nutrition and starts to oversaturate in its own ways, to lose weight or develop lesions and so forth. Plus, in impoverished countries, the World Health Organization is distributing drugs to try, in a false attempt to try and eradicate those countries of disease. And these very drugs are the very cause of these symptoms that are called then HIV in these third world countries. So a lot of shenanigans like that are being done.
Okay, so basically it started by poisoning the body. The symptoms were the body reacting to those poisons. Then, as usual, the pharmaceutical industry came in with more poisons, and those additional poisons ultimately lead to death of the organism.
Exactly. It's the same as if you have a cold and you don't stop eating and instead take a drug, you're threatening your life of your body. You continue eating, that increases the acidity, allows it to increase. That's threatening the life of the body. Then if you take drugs, that further poisons it, and you're bringing yourself even closer to possible death or harm, physical harm. Sensibly, a person, when they're overly toxic, exhibiting symptoms, they would just stop eating, give their body a rest, a chance to catch up on waste elimination. And once they then feel better, then they can continue eating and doing their other activities.
And ideally, these people would return to the natural diet to lessen that burden. But in an acute situation where you have that cold coming on, you have that flu coming on, the best course of action is to stop eating, fast,
Right.
Drink water, and allow the body to catch up and move through, and go to bed and rest.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. When you have a cold, people aren't taught to do that, so they think they can just eat their way out of it, and then they ultimately get so symptomatic that they can't produce any energy, and they're flat in bed, and their appetite's gone. And so they eat nothing, and in that, their body is catching up on waste elimination, and voila, a few days later, a week later, they feel great again and fit and ready to go.
Yeah, that reminds me of an old saying. A lot of people have probably heard it, but they've heard the represented version of it, the shortened version of it, most people have heard feed a cold, starve a fever. But in reality, the saying was, if you feed a cold, you will have to starve a fever. And it
That's
was
right.
an old wisdom that people knew that if you got a cold and you continued to eat, you would get sicker and sicker. You would create more disease symptoms because it was your body trying to eject and eliminate those toxins. But if you stopped eating, you fasted for the day or a few days, that the body would be able to catch up and eliminate that waste.
Yeah, exactly. You feed it cold, that means you increase the toxicity. It gets so great that you won't even want to think of food. It'll make you want to vomit. You're so toxic in your body.
And it's probably the case that when children are afflicted with measles, they get lots of warning symptoms like a scratchy throat or a runny nose or something, and they ignore it, or the parents continue to feed, and that's when it goes into the full-blown measles.
Yeah, that's classic.
And fever.
Yeah, you'll have little kids with runny noses because they're being fed all sorts of inappropriate cooked foods instead of fruit or mother's milk. And the mother just keeps on feeding, and then even adding drugs to the mix when they don't realize that runny noses because the body is overwhelmed in acids and trying to dilute the acids by secreting mucus, and it comes out through the nose, sinuses, and other organs.
Okay.
Okay, great. So we kind of touched on vaccines a little bit in that previous discussion. So we've established that viruses themselves, they're strands of RNA, they're cellular debris, they're not causing any disease. So then, is there any benefit to injecting viruses, dead spent viruses, or whatever else chemicals they're putting in these vaccines? Is there any benefit to the body? And I mean, this does seem like a pretty obvious answer, but is there any benefit to injecting poisons into a sick body or a healthy body, and can health ever come out of injecting poisons into the body?
Well, the only benefit that would be if a thug or a killer wanted to kill someone and they inject chemicals into them. I'm just joking, right? Now, yeah, to inject any abnormal substance into the body, any substance into the body, is to threaten the body's existence, whether it's air that you're injecting or water or dirt or anything. You don't want to inject to the body because it's bypassing the body's digestive system. The only thing that should be going into the human body is air, water if the body is thirsty, and normal foods, which then get chemically processed by the body. And those substances at first are not put into the body. When you breathe in air, it goes into your lung cavity, and then the cells of the body pick out the oxygen that they want and leave the rest. And so it is with food in the stomach. The body injects chemicals into the stomach cavity, which break down that food, and then the cell linings of the body pick out the chemicals, the breakdown products that they want, and leave the rest. Now, to inject a known poisonous substance like a vaccine or antibiotic into the body is to inject very dangerous chemicals that upset the body's chemistry and prevent DNA from running itself correctly, thereby starting the breakdown of the entire body. If those chemicals disrupt the ability of a certain organ or a part of the brain to operate properly, then that means the death of the body. That means the chemical balance of the body has been disturbed so much that it can no longer exist in the form of a human body.
And could you maybe explain a little bit why some people respond really aggressively to a vaccine, where we see, the sudden infant death syndrome, we see encephalopathy, various neurological disorders, and then other children seem to be relatively unharmed. Can you explain why that, why some children might be at higher risk for more cellular damage than others?
Well, source of that is how much of the vaccine gets into the blood system directly as opposed into the lymph system. When you inject into the skin, capillaries can be broken and that vaccine can get into the bloodstream that way and flow directly throughout the body by being in the blood and then coming into contact with brain cells or in other glands directly without having gone through the lymph system. If the vaccine, when injected through the skin, gets just into the lymph fluids, not into the blood, then the lymph nodes has a chance to detoxify that chemical or to somehow neutralize it, make it less effective, and then thereby be eliminated from the body or stored in a tumor in the body somewhere, something like that. So in that, when that happens, then the person their chemistry isn't in their bloodstream and their organs aren't being affected, their brain cells, and they don't have such symptomatic reactions. But if the that chemical does get into the blood, it can go to a certain part of the brain and stop its function. That'll be the death of the human. For example, part of the brain that controls breathing, those cells in the brain. And if those are disrupted, well, the baby will stop breathing, or the human will stop breathing, and that's the death of that human.
Okay, thank you. So one last question related to the viruses. The current pandemic is being driven by the use of the PCR test to diagnose infection. Can you explain a little bit about what the PCR test is and can the PCR test actually diagnose infection?
Well, the PCR test is not a test. It is an amplification technique. It is used to amplify detected DNA or RNA so that it can be seen. So amino acids are being reacted with a sample of DNA or RNA in a very complex reaction, and it creates the multiplication of that DNA or part of that DNA or RNA molecule so that it can be tested or looked at. The test cannot establish whether that DNA was cause of disease or a virus was present or something like that, because the test or this PCR method is only amplifying what was there, and it's not saying what the substance that was there and what it was doing. That's just the belief. A person will believe, oh, that DNA or that virus was doing this, that, and the other, but PCR has nothing to do with that. All it does is amplify that amount of DNA that they proposed was causing the problem.
Okay, so essentially they're taking a sample, they're getting the strand of RNA, DNA that they think is the culprit.
Yeah.
And then they are running it through this PCR, which is essentially just making a whole bunch of Xerox copies.
Exactly. Yeah.
And we just get a big pile of paper saying,
Yeah.
oh, we got all these copies, and so this is here, but it doesn't
you get
actually.
what you want. Yeah. It's like you see a person and you want to blame them for something, you just amplify them, get a whole bunch of similar people and say, see, they caused the problem. You just repeated it. You just Xeroxed them. That doesn't mean they caused it. You just Xeroxed them. That's all.
Okay, great. Thank you. Nora, do you want to continue on, maybe moving into natural hygiene?
Yeah. Robert, are there any schools of thought around health presently today that follow Bechamp's discoveries?
Well, there is one and the only one, that's natural hygiene. It follows philosophy of health that follows from Bechamp's discovery and correct analysis and study of true biology. Natural hygiene reveals, using Bechamp's biology and others, that health is created by maintaining a normal chemical environment within the body. Then the body can react normally, which we call health. So long as the body follows healthful habits, normal habits to it, it will create that environment automatically through its DNA. That natural hygiene then has a philosophy of health and disease in which the individual creates their own health or disease by their habits that they follow. There's nothing attacking from the outside. It's the individual themselves and the environment they create inside themselves by their very own habits. That opposes all other philosophies of disease, such as medicine and all these alternative medicine approaches, which never let go of the idea that something from the outside has invaded the body and forced the body to behave symptomatically. All right?
Right. So I think we've already established what colds and flus are and the purpose that they serve. Why does the body create disease symptoms? And I think this might be a good time to differentiate between constructive disease and degenerative or chronic disease.
Well, the body creates disease symptoms because its chemistry has been altered within, and that's all it can do in that environment. It's like if you're swimming in a sewer, all you can do is behave like you would. You plug your nose and get to shore and smell badly. That's all you can do when you're in a sewer. If you want to be able to swim nicely and breathe and not smell, then swim in clear water. All right? So the body, this DNA-run body, is behaving improperly because its acidity is too high. Its waste level within itself is too high. Wastes are predominantly acidic in nature. And so if a body that's being burdened with too much work, such as digesting false foods that are very difficult to digest, it will produce lots of the acidic waste, which then prevent oxygen exchange, which then lowers the ability of the body to eliminate waste, and it just cycles. So then the body behaves symptomatically. The body isn't trying to create disease. It all is happening. It's acting symptomatically. And in that symptomatic reaction, if the waste isn't increased, then the body can slowly catch up on the waste removal. And thereby the body will start to act normally again.
Okay, and if it doesn't, then we have the symptoms of constructive disease, which are like the safety valve that allows the extraneous, extraordinary elimination of toxins and wastes. At what point, I guess this would be a good time to talk about when that becomes chronic, or what causes it to become chronic.
Well, at first, the body will react symptomatically, which is called acutely, to this excessive waste level. It will do its best to eliminate the waste. If more wastes aren't created, then it can do that. It can do it fairly quickly. But if a person, say, continues eating, then more waste is being created, and that will stretch it out. Then the body isn't being damaged, it's being threatened. But if that waste level is left to continue at that level, such as a person keeps eating, they then have a constant running nose, the body, the structures of the body, the cells and the organs, are actually being damaged. They're being chemically harmed. Their structure is harmed. And that then is deteriorated and gets replaced by scar tissue, dead material, fibers that replace dead cells. And that's called degeneration. The cellular structure of the body has been eliminated. The more that occurs, the less function the body has, and that means it can't maintain itself, and then it will die. So you can have a heart full of lesions, or nerve cells losing their skin layers and being replaced by fibers, and then that cell can't operate normally, and so on. These are degenerative diseases, and they are a sign of the body actually breaking down, not just reacting to altered chemistry within itself.
Right. And it takes energy for the body to produce constructive symptoms. And sometimes people don't have enough energy for their bodies to do that, and they get chronic disease. And very often people will brag about how long it's been since they've had a cold or flu or whatever, but they're also showing the signs of chronic degenerative disease. So that would be an indication that their body just doesn't have sufficient vitality to cleanse itself, correct?
Yeah, correct. Their body has found a way to store poison, say, such as in tumors, little fiber encased packets. Instead of trying to eliminate the poison from the body, it doesn't no longer has the ability to do that through its chemistry. These tumors could become cancerous, and that cancer cells have been formed in them out of the DNA, and they just then continue to grow, not contributing to the body itself, just growing for their own sake. Then you get what's called cancer. Yeah, so a vital person has lots of power. When they indulge in a harmful practice, will express that as a symptom, and the less vital, the less ability the body has to defend itself from poisons or waste levels, the less it will exhibit those. It will not act that way. It'll be just degenerating.
And there are a couple symptoms that have been sort of more in the news lately than in the past, related to the current so-called pandemic. And one of them is that people say they lose their sense of taste and smell. Why does that happen?
Well, the acidic environment of the body, called acidosis, prevents nerves from operating normally. The nerve, which is run by DNA, loses its ability to run correct chemistry. And that chemistry, that normal chemistry, is what we sense, what we feel. When it's not able to run itself, we experience that chemistry within the cell as pain or lack of function. That nerve cannot send signals. So it is with irritated tongue fluids or nasal and so forth. When those nerves have been, their ability to function has been compromised, they can no longer send signals of what they are trying to sense or would have sensed, and then we don't experience that sense. We, in other words, lose our sense of smell or taste or hearing or whatever.
And if we're paying attention, this can be interpreted and should be interpreted as a loss of appetite, right? If you can't taste anything and you can't smell anything, that's your body saying it's time to stop eating, right?
Yeah, exactly. Just that I'm overtoxic. I can't run myself, can't run my nerves to sense what I'm trying to eat. So stop, allow the body to cleanse and reduce acid waste throughout the body, and then the nerves won't be irritated, and they will then be able to sense your appetite comes back, your senses come back. Your body's telling you, I am operational, let's go.
And why do some people experience shortness of breath?
That'll be for the same reason. Nerves within the lungs are being irritated. They're in a chemical environment that's too acidic that prevents them from acting properly. They'll spasm or just not function at all. And then the lungs of the muscles of the cell of the, muscles of the lung or the diaphragm are not being told when to expand or contract, and we lose our ability to breathe that way. We'll have nerve signals that might be too strong, and then you cough. The nerve's irritated basically, and its signals that it's being or was creating get confused, and so we cough, can't breathe properly, and so forth. Irritated lung nerves.
And these are perfectly normal symptoms of constructive symptoms. They're not new. It's not a new disease. There's absolutely nothing new about these things. It's what the human body has done since the beginning of time, when it's in a wasteful, irritated state.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And it's just something to recognize that something was done wrong. So for example, you have a car and something starts malfunctioning. No, you just go in there and replace the part. You put something new that does work in there and the car works again. Well, in the case of the human, all you have to do is remove the toxicity that caused that problem, that lack of function, and it operates again. It'd be just like feeding a car gasoline as opposed to diesel. Gasoline engine needs gasoline, not diesel. Put diesel in there and the diesel doesn't burn fast enough and the car clogs itself up on carbon debris and so forth, and then asymptomatically blows blue smoke and so forth, breaks down. But if you replace that diesel with gasoline, which is the car is designed to work on that, the car will operate beautifully.
That's a great analogy.
Thank you.
So do certain detox symptoms equate to different foods that we're eating? So for example, if somebody eats more protein, would they see more of certain types of detox symptoms? And if they eat more fat, would they see different symptoms? Or is it just a function of where the acids are hanging out in their body that creates the different detox symptoms?
Everything that we eat has its certain chemistry and will be broken down by the body to create all kinds of chemicals. And those chemicals determine how our body will be able to react. So if we eat highly dense protein materials, such as animal flesh, there's a lot of proteins in there that have to be broken down into amino acids, and that will overwhelm the body in acids and carbon dioxide that was used by the body in its metabolism to help break those down. So a certain chemistry in the body will be set up of all various chemicals from the meat digestion, and that will result in certain specific types of behavior of the body or symptomatic behavior. You can eat other foods that are, say, rich in fats, excessively rich in fats, and fats are broken down by a different chemical system or metabolism in the body. You get fatty acids, but slightly different chemistry to break that down. And that new chemistry will then create an environment in the body that will create particular types of symptomatic chemical behavior. All right, so each food will produce slightly different systems. On the whole, because it's generally acidic, you'll get similar. The body has similar ways of reacting to general toxicity, general acidity.
Okay. And can we talk a little bit about parasites? What is the function of a parasite? And we've seen people talking about a parasite called, I believe it's called Toxoplasmosis gondii. Not 100% sure on that, but where they are claiming that the parasite can control the mind of the person. Can a parasite control the mind of a person?
No, not in that way. When a person eats a harmful substance and overwhelms their body, they won't feel good. And you could say that controls their mind because they're not feeling good. They just won't want to do anything. Right? They think negatively and they're tired. All right. That's the extent that you could say something like that controlled the mind of the body. The mind being just the habitual thinking of the brain. Now, but no substance outside of us can control our mind. We do that ourselves through our cellular function. We decide what we think we're thinking. It's just like running. I decide to run because I want to run. Nothing can invade me and tell me to run. And so it is with thinking. I think. My brain is thinking. It's creating the thoughts. And something else comes into my body. It can't force me to think because it needs to be my brain itself that's creating that activity called thinking. Now, these parasites, these are just organisms that are said to be feeding on the breakdown products, the waste of another organism. So you can get a worm in your stomach, which is outside the body, feeding on whatever matter is in the stomach that the worm uses as food. Now that in a normal situation, a person will have that food in their stomach. They'll have their normal foods. If they've eaten the wrong foods like cooked foods, grains, and so forth, they can develop a worm that might ingest in that food, and that can then grow in the stomach or in the intestines because it's feeding on food that would not normally be in the human. So we have parasites that can be bacteria or worms or little critters, and they're just snacking on where they find something they can eat. they're acting in harmony with us. They're not there to kill us. Were they here to kill us, then they wouldn't exist themselves through evolution. If you destroy the food that is sustaining you, well, you run out of the method by which you sustain yourself and you go extinct as a result. So parasites are not there to kill. They're here just to feed, and they may not be pleasant for us to experience, but then we just would say if a fly has dug a hole in our skin, when you just get rid of it. But primarily you have to be eaten improperly in order to create the conditions, the food supply for them to attract them in the first place. So don't eat improperly, follow sensible habits, and you won't get so-called parasites. Parasites are usually large or organism, multi-celled, not disease, not bacteria. You could claim that bacteria is a parasite, but that's false because bacteria are created by our very own body in reaction to over-toxicity in the body. Our DNA creates them. That we're not preying on our own cells. We're just getting compromised chemically, that's all.
Right, very interesting. And we see this in the dogs as well, where when the dogs are coming off of kibble, they'll often have worms, tapeworms, different little parasites, and just within a few weeks of putting them onto a proper raw diet with lots of fruits, the dogs quickly expel the parasites. And am I correct in saying that that this is because the parasite has run out of food? It's no longer a suitable environment for the parasite because the internal environment has changed due to the diet being changed?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. That parasite doesn't have the chemistry around it, the food supply, that it can sustain its life. It would be like a human trying to live underwater. It's impossible. That's not the environment that a human can sustain its life in, so it would die and disappear. Whereas if it's in the atmosphere, on land, the human can survive. And so this parasite, this worm, has found an environment that it is able to use to sustain itself. In our guts, in a dog's gut, if it's eaten its normal food, that type of environment will never be created, and so it won't find worms there.
Right. So basically, the environment determines whether the parasite will exist, and if we change the environment, the parasite will leave.
Right. And in the body, that's a chemical environment, a specific chemical environment. And the normal environment is created by healthful living habits. Abnormal environments, chemical environments, are created by following false habits that cause the body overburden in its own waste, and thereby allow other organisms to develop in that new false chemical environment.
Okay, thank you. So I just have one more question going back to bacteria. Does bacteria produce acids that would eat away at the tooth enamel and cause or potentially cause damage to organs? So if our body is creating this bacteria, can the waste that is created by the bacteria potentially damage our body?
It could potentially do that, but what's really happening is that the whole entire body has become overly acidic, called acidosis. Too much acids within the fluids, the bloodstream, and the cells themselves. And teeth are made by the body's cell, and they are high in alkaline minerals. And the body will use those to neutralize acidity in the body. And so it'll take minerals from the teeth, from its structure, and use those to neutralize chemicals, and thereby the tooth is weakened. It starts to get cavities in it. And they get bigger and bigger, and then soon you have to go to the dentist and get filled with a filling. Now, in your mouth, we have bacteria. It's outside the body. And to the degree that the diet is false, acidic, creating you'll have more. Bacteria are growing in the food that's in our mouth. Bad bacteria could have come from the food itself, or our body could have produced it from right out of our own DNA. That's part of the mucus in the mouth. This bacteria will feed on the food that's in the mouth, grain or leftover steak or whatever, and feed on it and produce its own waste, acetic acid and 1,000 others. And that acid itself can act on tooth enamel. However, the saliva of the mouth is very alkaline and it will neutralize those acids. So generally the bacteria cannot do that. And what's happening again is that the tooth is deteriorating from inside itself and creating then cavities from the structure inside itself. On the surface, you will get acidic breakdown. You can have that if you have food stuck in your teeth, in between your teeth, and sitting there for a long time. And of course, acidic wastes are being made, and you will have a cavity created on the surface of the tooth eventually. But that takes quite a time. It's going to take years. All right.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because normally when you get a cavity, if it was something sitting on the tooth itself, you would expect that the cavity to show up in two teeth adjacent to each other, facing each other, where say a piece of food is sitting there or something like that. And the dentist, they always say, oh, well, it's the sugar sitting on the teeth. But in reality, if it was the sugar sitting on the teeth, we would see cavities in all of the teeth around the mouth, not in just an individual tooth. And so it makes far more sense for the tooth to be breaking down internally based on, it being connected. There's a whole host of nerves in the mouth and that connect the teeth to the bloodstream and the nerves and stuff like that. So it makes far more sense that it's essentially a alkaline mineral repository that the body pulls from when the system is over acid.
Yeah, exactly. And then the integrity of the tooth is being broken down from the inside, making it more vulnerable to the outside. Any damaging influence there, you get a weakened tooth, you can snap it or break it much more easily that way.
Right. So once again, it's a systemic problem.
Yeah, it's systemic. It's coming from the inside, and fundamentally, it's about wrongful living habits, primarily diet, because that's the area of life that is most abused and predominantly abused by people eating incorrect foods.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Robert. And thanks to everyone for watching. And we hope that you enjoyed our dismantling of the germ lie. We realize it can be very difficult to reconcile this information with what we're taught from a very young age. Minimally, it gives rise to many questions. Be assured the answers are all there if they are sought by a receptive mind. If you'd like more information about anything we've discussed, we're going to put a lot of links in the description box for further research. As important and fundamental as this information is, it means nothing without practical knowledge about how to create health in our everyday living habits. As you've just heard, the symptoms we associate with contagious disease are not contagious at all. They are body-initiated, self-limiting, and constructive, meaning they cleanse and purify the body. They need never happen at all and do not happen to people who live in such a way as to not unduly burden the body's waste elimination system. We're planning another video explaining the specific steps one must take to achieve health, so please watch for that in the very near future. Until then, take care.